16. If you had told me in 1986, after I was first diagnosed, that I would be still alive in 2002, I would have asked you what you were smoking. Robert Takahashi told a dark gold banquet room. This was met with polite laughter and a slightly ominous liquid cough from somewhere among the tables. Then again, he said, if you had told me in 1986 that one day 2 towers in our city would be brought down by hijacked airliners, I would have said the same thing. Earlier that night, in Jonah's loft, when Robert was practicing the speech, Jonah had interrupted to say he didn't see the relevance of the terrorism line, including it seemed knee-jerk, he said, but Robert insisted it was required. But as I well know, 16 years after my diagnosis, Robert went on, with access to protease inhibitors and good care, HIV remains a serious disease, but is no longer necessarily a death sentence. I'm grateful to Lambda Legal for providing me with a great place to work over all these years that I've remained surprisingly alive. The terrifying years, the tremendously sad years, and now this new era that I guess we could call the anxious years. I myself happen to be anxious but hopeful and very much alive. There was applause, then more coffee was poured, and the gelatinous roofs of unloved desserts were listlessly poked at, along with the obligatory free raspberries. Then another speech was given by a French virologist, and the final speech of the night was delivered by a diminutive activist nun who shook her fist as she leaned up toward the too-high microphone. June and Robert, in their good dark suits, sat at the head table. Dominica's had been a savings and loan at the turn of the 20th century, and now soaring ceilings and panelled walls lend themselves well to fundraising events such as this one. It was late February, and many of the winter benefits in the city had been cancelled. No one had the heart or the concentration to go through with them. But the organiser of this benefit had said something about how if we weren't going to give in to AIDS, we also weren't going to give in to terrorists. That logic didn't exactly track, but enough time had passed so that some of the generalised shakiness had gone away. Instead of feeling frightened all the time that another building would come down, that a dirty bomb would go off in Times Square, you could also feel a little defiant, and that was the mood here tonight. Many aging men in this room had danced closely together as young men or boys in the 1980s at places like Limelight or The Saint or Cresco Disco. Then their numbers had been thinned, and of the ones still alive, quite a few had ended up here tonight in business dress, holding on. Robert Takahashi was not, apparently, dying after all, at least not with certainty. It held on long enough for protease inhibitors to become standard protocol, and suddenly, astonishingly, if you were lucky enough to tolerate the side effects of the drugs, you might live for a very long time. No one they knew had ever thought this change would occur in their lifetimes. They'd imagined a death pile up continuing on into infinity. Still, it did often lead to death. People went unprotected, ignorant, passed it on, and in many places the drugs weren't affordable or weren't available at all, and so the world was still dying, and AIDS was still a reason why, but in some quarters there was hope. Death was often held off, pushed back. President Reagan had left the scene long ago, and now he was an elderly, confused man who probably no longer remembered how he'd once behaved, or maybe he only remembered certain glittering particular pieces of long presidency. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Tear down this wall. Tonight, having been the recipient of the Eugene Shavstein Award for Political Activism within the legal profession, Robert stayed on the glossy bar of Dominica's after the ceremony, and dinner had ended. Other younger men were still also hanging around, but the new generation barely looked over at Robert and Jonah, thinking they were stylish men from another generation, which at just past 40 they nearly were. Both of them had such a lot to drink. Robert wasn't supposed to do that, but tonight was a special occasion. He was fairly drunk when he tugged on Jonah's ice blue tie and said, "You look so good in a suit. I always tell you that." "Thank you. You should dress like this every day for work. You'd get your way in all the meetings. Everyone would want to do you. No one dresses up at my job, as you know." "I didn't know that. You hardly talk about your job. You hardly ask." In all their years together, Robert had only been to visit Jonah at Gage Systems once, and that was when the robotics firm was still at its old location. Robert had never seen Jonah's sun-filled cubicle with a drafting table and a corkboard on which he'd pinned a photo of himself and Robert, and another photo of the world's largest Lego sculpture, and one of his mothers singing on a river barge with Peter, Paul and Mary about 1,000,000 years ago. But to be fair, Jonah thought, he'd only been to Robert's office once too. It was just the way they were. On the nights they were together, one of them was usually preoccupied with something that didn't include the other. Even stripped down to boxes for bed, Robert was often on his BlackBerry, tapping away, and Jonah was at the table looking over designs. Half the week, Robert slept in his own apartment nearby on Spring Street. "Well, you look good," Robert said now at the bar, and he leaned forward and kissed Jonah quickly. Jonah's recoil was imperceptible, he hoped. Robert smelled like whiskey concentrate, and even under the best circumstances, Jonah Bay was not completely natural when it came to being physically demonstrative. But Robert let go of the tie and sat back on the stool, his expression readjusting itself. "Jonah," he said, "I need to talk to you." "Okay. We struck a bargain back in the beginning, don't you think?" Jonah felt himself tense down his arms and along sides of his calves. "I'm not sure what you mean," he finally said. "You couldn't handle too much with me, and that was okay, because truly I couldn't give you all that much then. I had this diagnosis. I was going to die, and we had to watch what we did, of course, and what we do, which has been fine, really, except now, as you know," said Robert, in deep discomfort, but forcing himself to keep going. "Seems I am not necessarily going to die of this. And honestly, Jonah, as time has gone by, I've been thinking that I want something more complete." "Complete? What the hell does that mean?" "Oh, you know, love, sex, the full package. Someone who throws himself into me physically and mentally." "And where are you going to find this package, Robert? This throwing himself in package?" Robert looked down into his drink, the default place to look during a breakup, which this was so hideously and amazingly turning out to be. "I found him," he said. "You found him?" A sour statement. "Yes." Robert looked up and bravely held Jonah's gaze. "At the board meeting 3 months ago. He's in research at Columbia. He's positive." "Not thinking," Jonah said. "He's positive he's in research?" "He's HIV positive, like me. We started talking. We fell into this, Jonah. It wasn't supposed to happen. I recognise that, but we found ourselves sort of free. It felt amazing. I don't think there's been too much freedom in our relationship, yours and mine." "Oh, freedom, that's the coveted thing, the holy grail, fucking without protection." "It's not just that," said Robert. "He knows what it means to live with this. And me, I have lived with you all these years." "No, not with me. You never even wanted me to move in. Look, I am this year's winner of Eugene Scharfstein Award, and I think I deserve a moment of big honesty here. You always wanted to keep yourself separate, Jonah. That was your doing, not mine, and I went along with it because what else could I do?" Each time he said Jonah's name, it got worse, as if Robert were a kindly, distant person speaking to someone who was doomed. After all this time, Robert was the survivor, while Jonah occupied a land between the ill and the well, a torturous purgatory in which he'd been forced to remain. "All right," said Jonah, gathering himself. "So what is it that you want now?" "I think I should go," Robert said. "Go? What does that mean? Go to this guy? This researcher?" He tried to give the word a sarcastic edge, but sarcasm just seemed immature now. "Yes." Robert took Jonah's hand, but his own hand was so cold from the drink that it felt as far from reassuring as possible. Jonah remembered the press of fingertips of a man who had already left him, who was already thinking of his researcher and the night ahead and what would follow, now that he could live and be loved, now that he was free. "Robert Takahashi said, it's been a very nice run. We weren't lonely. But now maybe we should see where the wind will carry us, so to speak." The streets of Lower Manhattan actually resembled a wind tunnel that night. Jonah's tie flipped over his shoulder and he stuck his hands into his coat pockets, feeling the contours of an old fossilized tissue inside one and the Lindy coins and Swansong subway tokens with the cut-out pentagram centers in the other. Jonah couldn't go home yet. Instead, he found himself at Ash and Ethan's doorstep, not too far away on Charles Street, ringing the bell, which gave a resonant sound from deep inside the house. A security camera purred and angled down on Jonah's face, and a female voice with a Jamaican accent spoke to him from an intercom. Yes, who is it, please? This was Rose, the nanny. Hi, Rose, he said as lightly as he could. Are Rush and Ethan around? It's Jonah Bay. Oh, wait, turn a little. Yes, I can see your face now. They're away, Jonah. They flew to the ranch in Colorado, but they'll be back tomorrow. Ethan's meetings. Is there anything I can help you with? No, he said. It's okay. Just tell them I was here. Wait a moment, alright? Alright. Jonah stayed in this time, not sure why he was being asked to wait, but very soon Rose opened the heavy door and asked him to come in. In the front hallway, a pale and tranquil space where the light seemed to come from a hidden source, the nanny handed Jonah a cordless telephone, and still partly drunk and anguished, he sat on a plum velvet settee below a large painting of a vanilla ice cream cone. Robert left me, he said to Ash on the phone with a suppressed cry. He left you, she said. Are you sure? It's not just fight. We didn't fight. He's got someone else. I'm shocked, Jonah. A researcher. Apparently I'm too withholding. That's not true, said Ash. You're a very loving person. I don't know what he's talking about, but of course she did know and was just being polite. When I come home, she said, I'm all yours, but spend the night at our house tonight, okay? Rose and Emmanuel will set you up. I wish we were there, but we flew the cast of Cuba out here for rehearsals, and Ethan came too. You can have breakfast with Larkin and Mo in the morning. Will it be okay? You can check on them for me. I hate to bathe from Mo. He doesn't do well with changing his routine. So Jonah spent the night in the second floor guest room, which in his view was almost as grand as the Lincoln bedroom in the White House. He distinctly remembered that his mother had taken pictures by a Polaroid the night she'd spent there, back when Jimmy Carter was president. Rosalind Carter had loved the Windwell Chaos and had cried a little when Susanna sang it after dinner. In the morning, the sunlight spread across the bed where Jonah slept, and someone knocked on the door. He sat up and said, Come in. Ash and Ethan's children walked into the room, and Jonah was startled to see how much they'd changed since he'd last saw them a few months earlier. Larkin was beautiful, poised, heading toward adolescence. Mo, poor kid, a bit uncertain, not exactly right, even just standing, doing nothing. The way he held himself was disconcerting. He stared at Jonah searchingly. Hey guys, Jonah said, sitting up and suddenly feeling self-conscious. He was never able to sleep with his shirt on, so he was bare-chested now. His hair, still long, had begun to go grey, and he worried that he appeared to these children like a menacing, effeminate gypsy. But Jonah always felt that something was wrong with him, no matter how many people exclaimed over his face or his long body, or his designs for devices to aid disabled people, or his gentleness, a word that often irritatingly got used to describe this held-back, polite man. Mum and Dad said you were here, Jonah, said Larkin. They said you should stay and have breakfast with us if you can. Emmanuel is making waffles that Mum says are to die for. I don't want to die, Mo said with a quivering mouth. You know that, Larkin. I was kidding, Mo, Sister said, putting an arm on his shoulder. Remember, it's a joke. Then, over her brother's head, she said, This is the most literal person any of us has ever met. That's the way people on the spectrum can be. After getting dressed, Jonah followed the sound of the children's voices, which led him one flight up to a well-stocked playroom. Larkin stood at an easel, painting a skillful landscape that was apparently based on the view from her bedroom and the ranch in Colorado. Mo lay on his stomach on the carpet like a much younger boy. So many Lego pieces were scattered around him that it appeared as if there had been a volcanic explosion, and all the flung bits had cooled and hardened. Jonah stood in awe, just looking. Long ago he'd loved Lego too, and what all those little pieces could do. In a sense, he'd gone to MIT because of Lego, and now he worked for Gate Systems because of his early interest in what interlocked and what did not. What are you making? He asked. A garbage clone, said the boy, not looking up. How does it work? Jonah asked, and he crouched down and let Mo Figman give him a demonstration of the uses of his invention. Right away he saw that Mo possessed a visceral understanding of mechanics that went deep and wide. Jonah questioned him about the functionality of the garbage clone and asked him a series of problem-solving questions relating to use, form, durability, aesthetics. Mo shocked him with his cool skill. Oops. Mo shocked him with his cool skill, yet he was grim about it all too. Like it was what he loved, but he behaved like a worker, like one of the child labourers who had inspired what had now become Ethan's cause. At the breakfast table a little later, Jonah was tended to like the figment's third child, instead of like a man who'd been broken up with by another man only 8 hours earlier. Jonah sat with the children in the sunny kitchen, looking out onto a garden that featured a wall threaded so heavily with vines it appeared like the underside of a tapestry. He ached to have lived here, to have had parents like Ash and Ethan and not like his mother, who'd been well-intentioned but unable to save him from being gripped off and diminished. Up in the farm in Dovecote, Vermont, Susanna Bay still lived with her husband Rick, and taught guitar and prayed, and was revered in the enclosed world, famous and beloved within the membrane of the Unification Church. She assured Jonah that she liked her life there very much, and that she had no regrets about slipping from this larger world into that smaller one. In her daily life she was admired for her talent, which was so much more than he could say for himself. "Are you okay?" Larkin suddenly asked him. Jonah was surprised, and he wasn't sure how to reply. "Why wouldn't he be okay?" Mo asked. "He doesn't have anything wrong with him." "Again, you're being really literal," Larkin said. "Remember, Mo, we talked about that." "I'm okay," Jonah said. "But if you're picking up something, it's just that I feel kind of sad right now." "Sad? Why is that?" said Mo, almost barking at the words, but impatient. "Well, you've met Robert, right?" "The Japan man," said Mo. "That's what I always call him." "Oh, you do? Oh, well, he doesn't want to be my partner anymore, so that was hard for me. He told me last night, which is how I wound up here." The conversation was starting to take a peculiar turn. Why was he discussing his love life and his breakup with 2 children? Also, the words felt imperfect. He hadn't exactly ever been anyone's partner. Larkin looked at her brother, fixing her gaze on him in a specific way that she had clearly done before. "No," she said. "Did you hear what Jonah said about being sad?" "Yes. So what's the appropriate response right now?" Mo looked around desperately, like someone searching the classroom walls for an answer on a test. "I don't know," his head dropping slightly. "Oh, it's really okay," said Jonah, putting a hand on my shoulder, which was awkward, like the back of a chair. "You do know," said Larkin softly. Her brother looked at her, waiting it out, waiting to remember. Suddenly he found the answer. "I'm sorry," Mo said. "Say it to Jonah." "I'm sorry." Ethan's son said it in a voice that strained for expression, though Jonah didn't have to strain to find any feeling to meet it. 17. Manny Wunderlich, at 84, was vigorous but mostly blind. His wife Edie was not so vigorous, though her eyesight was decent. Together, though, they were no longer in a position to have even a partial day-to-day director's role in the summer camp, and they both knew it. Probably they should have stopped completely years earlier. The 2010 season had just finished. Paul Wheelwright, the young man who had been running the place for them over the past few years, had been uninspired, they felt, and attendance was way down. Yesterday they'd fired him, telling him there was no hard feelings, but they were looking to go another wave of spirit in the woods next year. Manny, E.G., Paul had said to them, "I actually do have hard feelings because I tried to make this place work for you. In some ways you're both living in the past, and it's very frustrating for me. This just isn't the kind of camp that 21st century kids want. Kids are all tech savvy now. I know it's difficult for you to face that, but unless you find someone who can really bring the place into the present day, I'm worried that it's only going to get worse, and you're going to lose too much money to make it feasible to run at all. I could have done so much more with it if you'd let me." "Computer game design," Manny said with derision. "That was your idea of so much more." "Well, yes, we would have had a computer lab," said Paul. "It wouldn't just have been a place to design games or check email, though the kids could have done those things too. The parents would have loved to stay in touch with them electronically. As for computers, don't forget they're everywhere. But here, things are completely computerized now. But all summer, for instance, some of these kids were off in the animation shed drawing on paper. That's got nothing to do with the real world." "The real world," said Edie, offended. "Tell me, Paul, how well did someone like Ethan Wegman manage in the real world? He drew on paper too, didn't he? And yet he managed to adapt when things change. We gave him a foundation here, that's what matters. A foundation of creativity. Does everything have to be explicitly pre-professional? In my estimation, he ended up doing just fine. Or perhaps slightly better than fine, some people might say. Edie, I am obviously well aware that Ethan Figman attended Spirit in the Woods a very long time ago. He's mentioned it in many, many interviews, and I'm certain that you're extremely proud that he's an alum, as anyone would be. It's amazing and wonderful that you guys started. He paused. Why don't you hit him up? I'm sure he'd drop a bundle on this place if he knew you were struggling like this. He and his wife would probably bite a joint. She went here too, right? Didn't they meet him? We would never ask him for anything, said Edie. That's cross. Our motives are pure, Paul. Well, you can have all the purity you want, but if the place goes under, you know what you'll be left with? A lot of scrapbooks from old productions of Morning Becomes Electra, starring a bunch of 15-year-olds with zits. Now you're being rude, said Manny. I just think you're keeping these kids from having access to all the available tools, said Paul. It's amazing what's out there now. The internet has cracked open the possibilities for everyone. If a kid has always fantasized about Abbey Road, now he can suddenly be there on the street or even in the recording studio. Suddenly even a certain kind of virtual time travel is possible. It's amazing what this does for the imagination. Manny shook his head and said, oh, come on, you're telling me that because of the internet and the availability of every experience, every whim, every tool, suddenly everyone's an artist. But here's the thing, if everyone's an artist, then no one is. It's good to have principles, Manny, but I think you have to adapt to the times, said Paul. We have adapted, Edie said. In the 1980s, with multiculturalism, we made an executive decision to offer traditional West African drumming, and, as you know, our drumming teacher, Mamolu, has been with us ever since, with instrumental, so to speak, in helping him get a visa. Yes, that's terrific, and Mamolu is great, said Paul, but multiculturalism is easy. Of course you folded it into the life of the camp, and I know it's a much more diverse place now than it used to be, but I think technology is a lot harder for you both to accept. Racists and xenophobes think multiculturalism is the enemy of America, but you guys think technology is the enemy of art, which is also not true. When Ethan Figman was a camper in, the mid-1970s, I guess, the technology didn't even exist. Now it does, and you can't pretend it doesn't. Artists in all fields have tremendous digital tools available. Composers do, even painters. 90% of all writers use computers. I understand if you want to move on from me, but even without me, I think you need to make some changes across the board, not just getting computerized, but also maybe branching out a bit in other directions. What directions? And many in a defeated voice. His eyes would not let him really see the face of his tormentor. All he heard was this dispiriting barrage of doomsday reports emanating from a hazy male figure who shook his head a lot. Well, like llamas, I've already told you that you could offer a workshop in llama care. A lot of camps have that these days, and it's very popular. Girls in particular seem to like taking care of them. They are smarter animals than you think, and quite manageable. Thank you for your input, said Manny. And well, you could offer sports, not just ping pong or the occasional frisbee toss. One arts camp I heard of even has a Quidditch team, he said with a light laugh. Today's arty teenagers are more well-rounded than in the past. They want to bulk up their resumes. Speaking of which, you could also offer community service credit. For what? Cried Edie, the tougher of the two, when the lives. They cleaned their teepees, they sewed costumes for mid-year, they helped each other all the joint. No, said Paul patiently, for real things. And there is something else too. You need to be on social media. I recognize that phrase hurts your eardrums, but bear with me. You should not only have a page on Facebook, but you should be on Twitter. Twitter, said Manny, waving his hand. You know what that is? Termites with microphones. This is really quite enough, Paul, said Edie. You've made your point. We appreciate all the work you've done. Your last paycheck should be in the front office. You ought to run along. Now who's being rude? He murmured, and he shook his head as he walked away. On a city bus, Jules Jacobson White drowsed and drifted. The night before, she and Dennis had returned from taking Rory up to the State University in Oneonta for the start of her senior year. Rory was looking forward to taking a class in a subject her parents didn't understand, environmental spaces. Though not stellar like Lucky Figman, Rory had emerged from childhood intact. a meddling student and an anti-enthusiastic person who knew she wanted to be in motion, to be outside in the world, out in environmental spaces. She had moved out of the apartment smoothly and histrionically when she left for college, though people said that because of the terrible economy, kids didn't fully leave home until age 26 anymore, she showed no sign of needing or wanting to come back. Rory occasionally descended over a school vacation with a couple of friends in tow, all of them outdoorsy, jocular young women, not entirely knowable by their parents. At age 51, Jules and Dennis were entering what, for most people, was a quieter period, a slight roll down a soft incline. Dennis remained in decent spirits from the Stabilivox, though it made him gain weight that he couldn't take off. He liked being back at the clinic, and he now subscribed to 3 different sonography journals and had become so knowledgeable that the staff at the clinic all came to him with questions. Jules and Dennis had rented a car for the drive up to Hunter, the no-nonsense daughter with the frizzy dark hair and big open face, had hugged each parent in turn. Then one of her housemates in the pink off-campus rundown Victorian had leaned way too far out an open second-floor window and called, "Rory, get your ass up here." And now, riding the packed bus down Broadway to her office, Jules sat with her head against the window, her eyes flickering closed and then open when she became aware of a woman sitting across from her. Soon the whole bus became aware of her too, every few seconds. The woman gave herself a severe smack in the face. Jules watched with excited shock. Then the woman accompanying this poor woman gently took her hand, whispering something to her. They actually seemed to be having a conversation, and the disturbed woman smiled and nodded. There was a moment of silence, and then the disturbed woman freed her hand, and once again, bang, she hit herself even harder. Again, the other woman spoke to her gently. They looked somewhat alike and were probably sisters. Maybe they were even twins, but the disturbed one's face had been rearranged over time by the agonies of her condition, so the two women really didn't resemble each other all that closely. Jules, who knew she ought to look away now, though it was indecent not to, found herself unable to do that. She turned her rubbernecking attention to the sister who was softly speaking. Jules stared at her, and as she did, the woman's face seemed to reveal its younger self, and Jules thought, "I know you." This was another so-called sighting. She stood up and confidently said, "Jane." The woman looked across the aisle at her, at once smiling and amused. "Jules." Jane Sell. Jules's former TP mate from Spirit in the Woods stood too, and they hugged each other. Jules suddenly remembered the late-night TP conversation during which Jane had discussed her twin sister, who she said had a neurological disorder that caused her to hit herself for no apparent reason. "This is my sister Nina," Jane said, and Jules said hello. As Jules and Jane spoke, Nina continued her self-savaging, but Jane was used to it, seemed composed and undistracted as she recounted for Jules what happened in her life over the past 30-plus years. "I work for a foundation in Boston that gave grants to orchestras," Jane said. "My husband's an oboist. I gave up music myself. I was good, but not that good. But I knew I still needed to be around the arts. I'm in New York this weekend for a conference and to visit Nina." Jane's L51 had a brightness to her face that she'd always had. It was a relief to see that it hadn't disappeared. "Are you in touch with anyone?" Jules asked. "Nancy Mangieri once in a while." "And are you and Ash still friends?" said Jane. "Oh yes." She felt a flood of pride as she said it. "It's amazing about Ethan," Jane said. Nina suddenly smacked herself with even more ferocity. "Pow, pow, pow." Jane leaned down and said a few words, then returned to the conversation. "You know who I ran into Boston last week?" said Jane. "Manny and Edie." "Really?" We've totally been out of touch," said Jules. "Once after I got married, my husband and I were in New England in the summer and we stopped by, but that was the last time I saw them. I always had a fantasy that when my daughter was a teenager she'd go to Spirit in the Woods, but when she was 15 she wanted to go to wilderness camp, and now she's daughter always travelled with her parents in the summer, going to other continents, helping with the school that Ethan started." "Edie looks the same, mostly," Jane said, "pretty solid, like always. Manny is basically blind, which is sad. The camp still runs, but they said it's been limping along and that they're looking for someone new to run it next summer." Jane's her sister Nina were planning to get off at the next stop, before they did, there was a sentimental embrace between the old friends, and Lena slapped herself a couple more times, and then Jules and the whole bus watched as sister stepped out onto Broadway. Jules closed her eyes for the final couple of stops during their slow ride in morning traffic, but the conversation with Jane had made her start to buzz and fizz. She was in her teepee, she was in the theatre. She was in the dining hall where the meal was green lasagna and a salad topped with tangled sprouts. She was sitting on the hill listening to Susanna Bay sing. She was in the animation shed receiving the surprising pressure of Ethan Figman's mouth. She was in Boy's teepee free, smoking a damp joint and looking at Goodman Wolf's hairy golden legs as they hung down from an upper bunk. She was putting on a refugee accent in improv class. She was sitting on her narrow bed at night talking to Ash. No, she was happy. Listen, there is something we need to discuss today, Jules said to her client Janice Kling late one Thursday afternoon. Nearly a month had passed since she'd run into Jane Zell on the bus, and in that time Jules had behaved like someone in a trance, following orders from an obscure source. From the moment she found a chance to get back to Spirit in the Woods, that place where her life had opened and spilled and thrust her to the ground, delirious and changed, she'd moved fast. After the idea of applying for a job had occurred to her, she'd gone to tennis and he'd laughed indulgently, thinking she wasn't serious. They discussed it for 3 days before she even called Manny and Edie. By the end of those 3 days, Dennis had been talked into considering it. A few other applicants were also sentimental Spirit in the Woods alumni. At the interview held in the Midtown hotel room, the Wunderlichs looked extremely old to Jules, but then again they always had, even in 1974. Edie was still thickly built and bossy, and Manny was grandfatherly, with white eyebrows that sprang out like branches he had to swerve away from. Jules felt breathless in the Wunderlichs' presence, just hearing their familiar voices talk about this person and that one from the past. After all, the menacing threat which Dennis politely listened certainly warned. They began discussing what the job would entail and what the challenges were. The interview lasted an hour, and it ended with effusive hugs from the Wunderlichs, which seemed like a good sign, but you never knew. Then Jules waited, and 2 days later the call came with the offer. She picked up the message in her office between clients. The voicemail was from Edie, who said, "Well, we saw everyone, but you two are the ones we want. Will you be able to move up to Belknap in spring?" Jules let out a little woofing sound and immediately covered her mouth, remembering that she'd already buzzed a client in who was now sitting in a waiting room. It was not ideal to hear one's therapist roof. That evening, Jules and Dennis accepted the offer. It was uncertain as anything. They'd been hired provisionally. At the end of summer, they and the Wunderlichs would reassess the situation and see whether it was a good fit. Dennis had been assured he'd be rehired at the Chinatown clinic if for some reason he returned to the city after the summer. The understaffed clinic needed him there. Dennis knew so much and was very valuable to them. Jules, though, had to close her practice. There was no way she could keep her clients suspended. She would have to tell them that she'd help them seek other therapists if that was what they chose. Though the Wunderlichs were only committing to the one summer, Jules felt fairly confident. And if it worked out, running the camp would become a year-round job. She and Dennis would be required to slump aggressively for Spirit in the Woods, finding prospective campers and boosting enrollment in the off-season. So this morning she had begun to tell her clients that she was giving up her practice and moving away from New York City in April. The next 12 months, she said, would be spent talking with them about whatever came up and trying to find closure, the impossible thing that no one had ever really experienced in life, because there always seemed to be a little patch up, a slit of light. 2 clients cried, including Sylvia Klein, but Sylvia often cried, so it wasn't a surprise. And a speech pathologist named Nicole asked if she could take Jules out to dinner and be her friend now that Jules would no longer be her therapist. Jules demurred, but told her she was very touched by the offer. Most of the encounters had been like this, moving and a little mystifying. She knew these people, but they didn't really know her. Now, at the end of the day, here was Janice Kling, her longest-standing client, to look forward to her sessions with religious verve, even though it seemed that the quality of her life generally stayed the same. Janice still mourned the absence of intimacy and had not been touched in a very long time. She was alone and went on dates with men she described as uninteresting. She was faithful to therapy, though, and to her work with Jules. It was the centre of the week, maybe her life. So I'm leaving New York this spring. Jules told Janice Kling. Suddenly she worried for Janice, wondered what would become of her. Whether she would be okay. The city was hard on single people after a certain age. Loneliness could be felt so sharply here, and sometimes if people weren't in twos, they started to hang back, stay home. I'm closing my practice. How far away will you be? Janice asked, because my friend Karen, the one with lupus, the therapist, moved to Rhinebeck, and Karen takes Metro North up there once a week. I could do that. I won't be doing therapy anymore. Are you sick? Janice asked in anxiety. No, I'm fine. Then what is it? Guess it's one of those second acts in American Lives moments. Jules said, I don't understand. I'm actually going to be the director of a summer camp. A summer camp? Said Janice, shocked. That's what you're giving this up for? What if it doesn't work out? What if you find out that you're bad at it? I guess that's always a possibility when you try something new, said Jules. But she and Dennis had thought this through. They owned their apartment. The salary and their low expenses at Balnoff would make it possible for them to return to the city after each summer ended and work for the camp from their apartment until the spring, at which point they could try to sublet for a few months. Also, if the job proved to be a disaster, according to either of them or the Wonderleys, they would still have their home to return to. Jules's practice, however, would be lost. I can't believe you're doing this. Doesn't it feel bizarre? Asked Janice, and no offence, but what does running a summer camp have to do with being a therapist? It seems to me that they are completely unrelated. Don't you feel that way too? I just can't see you ringing a wake-up bell or singing Kumbaya. I know the news comes out of nowhere, and I'm sure there is a lot about it that's going to keep coming up, said Jules. She saw fears but hurt conveyed in Janice's eyes, but it had been in there for so long already, and though she wished she could make it go away, she'd never really been able to before, and now she knew it would. That night Jules lay in bed, overly anxious and rustling, and beside her Dennis said, You okay? Who makes such a change at our age? No one. Well, we're pioneers. Yeah, right, in our Conestoga wagon. And I know I've let my clients down. You have to live your life. I don't really mean I let them down by leaving. I mean by having stayed all this time too. I found my way of being with them, and I was always interested in their lives and in the things that blocked them. I'll miss them. I really have to leave them. But the reality is, I'm not all that much more talented as a therapist than I was as an actor. I wasn't what you'd call a natural. She thought about this. Actually, back in spirit in the woods, everything did seem to come naturally. It was sort of electric. That's why I got there. Jules rested her head on Dennis's shoulder and would have stayed like that, falling asleep there. I suggested they go for a walk and maybe even go have a drink at a bar to celebrate, he said, like Rory said. Alright, on separate extensions of the phone with Rory, who was up at school, they told her the sudden new plan. She'd been silent at first, shocked. Are you both shitting me? She finally said. No. Dennis said, your parents shit you not. Can we move on from this lovely exchange, please? Jill said, though she was actually a little nervous about what Rory thought. Fully grown children often had a difficult time with changing their parents' lives, she knew. They wanted everything to be the same forever. In an ideal world, parents of grown children would never divorce, would never sell the childhood home, would never make any sudden moves to suit themselves, but this was a fairly significant sudden move, and Jules wasn't surprised that Rory was shocked. You're really doing this? Rory asked. I think we are, said Dennis. I guess it's a bit startling to you. Rory laughed, her familiar chesty laugh. Jesus, there, you guys don't do things like this. Big moves. That's true, we generally don't. You sure this isn't some kind of early dementia? I'm mostly kidding, she quickly added. I think we have all our faculties, said Jules. Well, okay then, said Rory. I mean, it's more than okay. Congratulations, you guys. Will you visit us up there? Jules asked. Sure, maybe at the end of the summer. I do want to see the place. Anyway, you should celebrate, right? Even if this is just a midlife crisis or something, you should definitely celebrate. So now, following her advice, they fished into the laundry hamper, put back on the clothes they'd only taken off an hour earlier, and headed for the elevator. Outside, walking eastward, the streets increasingly stirred. They found a little bar called Rockies on a side street. To their surprise, it was fully populated. A couple of the men there looked familiar, though Jules couldn't figure out why. In a small red booth, she and Dennis drank their beers. Who are these people? He asked. They looked like people we sort of know, like people you see in a dream. The men's faces appeared relaxed, middle-aged and older, with occasional set of young sharp features. Accents drifted over strands of Eastern Europe, and maybe also Ireland, but Jules couldn't exactly place any of it or tease it apart. "I don't know who they are," she said. "Wait," Dennis suddenly said. "I do. They're the doormen in the neighbourhood. After they get off work, this is where they come. Off duty, out of their great coats and peaked caps." The doormen looked completely different, but yes, it was them, members of one of the countless subcultures in the city. "We've never had a doorman," said Dennis, "and there will probably never will, which is fine with me. I wanted to say," he said to her, "that I am very impressed with you for doing this, being impetuous, really making us go up there and do this." Joe Dennis hadn't gone to the camp. He had willingly been educated in its lore over the decades. Sometimes seemed to her that Dennis had gone there. He knew 3 of the central relevant figures, and he knew so much about some of the others. If he had been given a pop quiz about his 5 summers at Spirit in the Woods, he would have done well. Sandbox by Edward Albee, he would have answered correctly. Ida Steinberg, the cook, and he would have been able to write detailed observations about what the place had meant to his wife back then, what it meant to her later on. Spirit in the Woods was the camp that would not die, the camp that would not leave her, so instead she decided to go there to become it. Ash and Ethan and Jonah had all been excited and shocked when she told them about the job. "You'll actually be living there again," Ethan said. "You'll be in charge of the whole place. You're going to the animation shed. That's amazing. Take pictures." "For selfish reasons," Ash said. "I want you to stay in the city forever, but I know that isn't fair. And it's not like I'm home so much anyway. I'm always running off on you. It's just so hard to think of you not being here, that this is maybe the end of our New York life together. That's huge." "I know," said Jules. "It feels that way to me too. But it's also touching that you'll be there carrying the torch," said Ash. "I wish we could come visit this summer, but I'll be directing, and there will barely be on the East Coast. Maybe we can kiss it in the end with a little luck." Jules knew that Ash and Ethan had the week-long mastery seminars in Napa, during which Mo would be with them, along with a caregiver, before he had to return to boarding school, and Larkin was planning on attending a Yale summer program in Prague. Her parents would visit her there after Napa. "Next summer for sure," I said, "but you'll give me a detailed report about everything, a blow-by-blow. Walk around and do some of those virtual tours, telling me everything that's different and everything that's the same. Do you get to decide what plays they put on, or do you at least get to make suggestions? I know some accent plays with strong parts for women. I will take that under advisement." Jules and Dennis finished their drinks now and went inside into the street. The city, this place that they had managed rather than conquered, had its own relentless activity even at 2 a.m. Somewhere far off, someone was banging metal against metal. She linked her arm through Dennis's, and they headed back to their apartment along the unremarkable streets. For though already Jules was putting a lake behind them and a mountain before them, she dotted the landscape with teenagers and with bunches of bumblebees hanging low over white flowers, with a crude but functional theatre and an animation shed and a dance studio and various indestructible teepees built of unfinished wood. Shredded llamas, for she had been warned by the vandalist that today all summer camps needed to offer llama care for reasons unknown. Never loved the poor llamas whose faces were as narrow as shoes. Here in this green and golden world, among mountains and paths and trees, Jules and Dennis would venture out together. In the woods, she would be spirited again. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm so sorry about some of the background noise. I hope the cars weren't too distracting, but I think there was someone outside in the hallway at some point, so I'm so sorry about that. Please let me know if you have any suggestions. I love reading in an ASMR kind of tone. This was 2 chapters of The Interesting by Meg Wolitzer. A really fabulous book that I'm currently reading. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think, if this was absolutely horrible or if you liked it a lot, or just constructive criticism, I guess. I'm happy to take any reading suggestions, or even start this book from the beginning, or continue with it. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Bye.